I was standing in my front yard in Wilmington, Delaware, watching a crew of 4 men in bright orange vests raking my leaves into massive piles when I realized I had never called anyone to do this work. My name is Vincent Garrison, and I had moved into this quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove Estates about 6 months ago, back in May of last year. The tree-lined streets and colonial-style homes had seemed perfect for someone looking to settle down after years of apartment living. What I didn't know was that the Homeowners Association president, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, would become the bane of my existence. I walked toward the nearest worker, a stocky guy with a graying beard who was stuffing leaves into industrial-sized bags. "Excuse me," I called out. "Who hired you guys?" He looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the crisp November air. "Some lady from the HOA. Said the homeowner here was violating some code or something. We got a work order and everything." My stomach dropped. "I never authorized this. Do you have paperwork?" The man nodded and pulled out a crumpled invoice from his back pocket. Sure enough, it had my address on it, but the signature at the bottom belonged to Patricia Hendricks, HOA president. The total cost listed was $3,000 for complete leaf removal, lawn treatment, and debris hauling. "Stop," I said firmly. "Stop working right now." The bearded man raised his hands defensively. "Look, buddy, we're just doing our job. We got paid already, so whether we finish or not doesn't matter to us, but you'll need to take it up with whoever hired us." "Who paid you?" "The HOA lady. Patricia something. Gave us a check yesterday as a deposit." I felt my blood pressure rising. Patricia had not only trespassed on my property by hiring a crew without my permission, but she had also used HOA funds, which meant my own dues money, to pay for unwanted services. This was beyond overstepping. This was a violation of my property rights. I pulled out my phone and dialed Patricia's number, which I had saved from the welcome packet I received when I first moved in. She answered on the third ring, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Vincent, hello. I assume you're calling to thank me for taking care of that eyesore in your yard." "Thank you," I repeated, incredulous. "Patricia, you sent a crew to my property without my permission. That's trespassing, and I never authorized any work to be done." "Well, according to Section 7.3 of our HOA bylaws, any property that fails to maintain acceptable standards can be addressed by the board with or without homeowner consent. Your leaves were piling up for 2 weeks, Vincent." 2 weeks. Mrs. Chen next door complained about them blowing into her yard. "I was planning to rake them this weekend," I said through gritted teeth. "And even if I wasn't, you can't just send people onto my property without asking me first. That's illegal." Patricia let out an exasperated sigh. "Everything I do is within my rights as HOA president." "Perhaps you should have read the bylaws more carefully before purchasing in a managed community. The crew will be finished in a few hours, and the cost will be added to your next quarterly dues statement." "The hell it will," I shot back. "I'm not paying for something I didn't ask for." "Then we'll place a lien on your property." "Your choice, Vincent." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, shaking with anger. The crew had stopped working and was watching me nervously. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Getting angry at these workers wouldn't solve anything. They were just trying to make a living. "Look," I said to the bearded man, "I'm sorry, but I need you guys to leave. This is a dispute between me and the HOA, and I don't want you caught in the middle." He nodded slowly. "We'll pack up, but just so you know, we already got paid for the full job. If we don't finish, that's between you and her." "I understand. I appreciate you being reasonable about this." The crew loaded their equipment back into their truck within 15 minutes. I watched them drive away, then surveyed my yard. They had managed to clear about a third of the leaves, leaving uneven patches of exposed grass mixed with untouched piles. It looked worse than when they had started. I went inside and immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb, who had handled the closing on my house. After explaining the situation, he let out a low whistle. "That's textbook trespassing," Marcus said. "HOAs have certain rights, but they absolutely cannot send contractors onto your property without notice and consent, regardless of what their bylaws say. Those bylaws don't supersede state and federal property laws. So what can I do?" Well, you have a few options. You can sue the HOA for trespassing, sue Patricia personally, or both. You could also file a complaint with the Delaware Department of Justice, since this involves potential misuse of HOA funds. But here's my suggestion: document everything. Take photos of your yard, get copies of the work order, save all your communications with Patricia. Then send her a formal demand letter. Demanding what? Compensation for the trespassing, emotional distress, and any damages to your property. You're well within your rights to bill her or the HOA for the violation. An idea began forming in my mind. How much could I reasonably bill them for? That depends. What's your property worth? What did the trespassing cost you in terms of time, stress, and the mess they left behind? You could also factor in punitive damages to discourage future violations. I've seen cases where property owners successfully claimed anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 for unauthorized entry by service workers. $8,000, I said decisively. I want to bill them $8,000. Marcus chuckled. That's actually quite reasonable given the circumstances. I'll draft a demand letter for you. Give me until tomorrow morning. I spent the rest of that day documenting everything. I took dozens of photos of my yard from every angle, showing the half-finished leaf removal job. I photographed the tire tracks the crew's truck had left in my grass. I even went door to door and spoke with neighbors to see if Patricia had done this to anyone else. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman in her 70s who lived next door, invited me in for tea. Her home smelled like jasmine and old books. She settled into a floral armchair and shook her head sympathetically. "Patricia has been president for 3 years now," Mrs. Chen said, "and every year she gets worse. Last summer, she tried to fine the Robinsons across the street because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Can you imagine? Wrong shade of black. Did you really complain about my leaves?" I asked carefully. Mrs. Chen's face flushed. "Oh, Vincent, no." Well, I mentioned to Patricia at the last board meeting that some leaves had blown into my yard, but I wasn't complaining. I was just making conversation. I would never ask her to do something like this. I know how to use a rake. I felt relieved. At least my neighbor wasn't conspiring against me. Has she ever sent crews to other people's properties without permission? Not that I know of, but she's threatened it plenty of times. She carries around this binder with photos of everyone's homes, looking for violations. It's obsessive. After leaving Mrs. Chen's house, I knocked on a few more doors. The pattern became clear quickly. Patricia ruled the HOA with an iron fist, sending violation notices for the smallest infractions. Someone's trash can was visible from the street for 10 minutes too long. Someone else's holiday decorations stayed up 3 days past the approved date. Another homeowner got fined because their grass was 1 inch taller than the maximum allowed height. But I seemed to be the first person she had actually sent contractors to without permission. Lucky me. That evening, I went through the HOA bylaws with a fine-tooth comb. Section 7.3, which Patricia had cited, did give the board authority to address property maintenance issues. However, the full text included important caveats. The board had to provide written notice of any violation, give the homeowner 30 days to remedy the situation, and only after that period could they take action. Even then, the bylaws specified that action meant fining the homeowner, not sending crews onto private property. Patricia had violated her own rules. The next morning, Marcus emailed me the demand letter. It was beautifully written, full of legal language that made my case sound ironclad. The letter demanded $8,000 in compensation for unauthorized entry, trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. It gave Patricia and the HOA board 14 days to respond before I would pursue legal action. I printed 3 copies, certified one for Patricia's home address, one for the HOA's registered business address, and kept one for my records. Then I drove to the post office and sent them off. For the next week, I heard nothing. I finished raking my leaves properly, making sure every inch of my yard was immaculate. I wasn't going to give Patricia any legitimate ammunition. Meanwhile, I kept researching Delaware property law and HOA regulations. The more I learned, the more confident I became that I had a solid case. On day 9, my phone rang. It was Gerald Moss, who introduced himself as the HOA's attorney. His voice was measured and professional. "Mr. Garrison, I'm calling regarding your demand letter. I've reviewed the situation with my clients, and I have to say, you've raised some valid concerns." "Valid concerns," I repeated. "Your client committed trespassing. That's not a concern, it's a crime. I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. However, $8,000 seems quite excessive for what amounts to a miscommunication." Miscommunication. "Gerald, Patricia sent a crew onto my property without my knowledge or consent. She violated my property rights, the HOA's own bylaws, and possibly committed fraud by using HOA funds for unauthorized purposes. $8,000 is actually on the low end of what I could claim." There was a pause. "What would you say to a settlement? We could offer you $2,000 and a formal apology from the board." "No. No. I want the full $8,000, plus a guarantee that Patricia will not harass me or violate my property rights again. I also want a full audit of HOA finances to ensure she hasn't misused funds elsewhere." Gerald sighed. "Mr. Garrison, you're asking for quite a lot. Then I'll see you in court. I've already started preparing my lawsuit, and I have a very good attorney. When I win, and I will win, the HOA will pay not just the $8,000 but also my legal fees, court costs, and whatever additional damages the judge sees fit to award. Your choice." Another long pause. "Let me discuss this with my clients. I'll call you back in 48 hours. He hung up, and I allowed myself a small smile. I was playing hardball, but I knew I had the stronger position. Marcus had already warned me that the HOA's attorney would try to lowball me. The fact that Gerald was calling at all meant they knew they were in trouble. 2 days later, Gerald called back. This time, he sounded tired. "Mr. Garrison, after extensive discussions with the board, they're prepared to offer you $5,000 and a written agreement that Patricia will not interfere with your property without prior written consent. $6,000, the written agreement, and Patricia has to personally apologize to me in writing. Also, I want confirmation that the crew was paid out of Patricia's personal funds, not HOA money." That last part might be difficult. The payment did come from the HOA operating account. "Then I want a full financial disclosure showing that Patricia will reimburse the HOA for the expense. She acted without board approval, which means she committed fraud. If the board won't hold her accountable, I'll file a complaint with the state." Gerald went quiet for a long moment. "You're not making this easy. She shouldn't have trespassed on my property. Give me one more day. When Gerald called the next afternoon, he got straight to the point. $7,000 final offer. Patricia will reimburse the HOA for the crew's cost. She'll provide a written apology, and the board will draft a formal policy prohibiting unauthorized entry onto homeowner property. Take it or leave it. I pretended to think it over, even though $7,000 was more than I had hoped to get. Deal. But I want everything in writing within 1 week and payment within 2 weeks. Agreed. The documents arrived 6 days later via courier. The settlement agreement was thorough, covering every detail we had discussed. Patricia's apology was terse and clearly written through gritted teeth, but it was there. The financial disclosure showed that she had indeed used HOA funds without board authorization, and she was being required to pay back the $3,000 within 90 days. The check for $7,000 arrived exactly 2 weeks after my phone call with Gerald. I deposited it immediately, feeling a sense of vindication I hadn't experienced in years. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks after the settlement, I received a notice that there would be an emergency HOA board meeting. The agenda listed only one item: vote of no confidence in current board president. I marked my calendar and made sure to attend. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building with beige walls and uncomfortable folding chairs. About 40 homeowners showed up, which Marcus told me was unusually high attendance. People were clearly interested in what was happening. Patricia sat at the front table, her face pinched and angry. Beside her were the other board members: Frank Morrison, the vice president, Sandra Liu, the treasurer, and Tom Reeves, the secretary. All three looked distinctly uncomfortable. Frank called the meeting to order and cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. As you know from the agenda, we're here to discuss a vote of no confidence in our current president. Before we proceed, I want to give Patricia a chance to address the community regarding recent events. Patricia stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She was probably in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that specific way that seemed universally popular among women who wanted to speak to the manager. She wore a cream-colored blazer and a pearl necklace. I have served this community faithfully for 3 years, Patricia began, her voice tight. Everything I've done has been in the best interest of maintaining our property values and upholding our standards. Recently, one homeowner decided to twist a simple maintenance issue into a legal matter, costing this HOA thousands of dollars in settlement fees. Several people turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. Patricia continued. I followed the bylaws to the letter. Section 7.3 clearly gives the board authority to address maintenance violations. If people are upset that I take my duties seriously, then perhaps they should run for the board themselves. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. Patricia, did you give Vincent Garrison written notice before sending that crew to his property? Patricia's jaw tightened. The notice was implied. His leaves were a clear violation for over 2 weeks. That's not what the bylaws say, the man continued. I looked them up after I heard about this. You're supposed to give written notice and 30 days to comply. You didn't do that. The bylaws give the board discretion, Patricia shot back. Sandra Liu, the treasurer, spoke up quietly. Patricia, you also used HOA funds without board approval. That's a serious issue. We have specific procedures for expenditures over $500. It was an emergency maintenance situation. No, Frank interjected, it wasn't. And that's the problem, Patricia. This isn't the first time you've overstepped, but it's the most egregious. We've received complaints from multiple homeowners about your aggressive enforcement tactics. The board has tried to address this privately, But after the settlement with Mr. Garrison, we can't ignore it anymore." Patricia's face turned red. "So you're going to throw me under the bus because some entitled homeowner couldn't be bothered to rake his leaves?" I had been planning to stay quiet, but that crossed a line. I stood up. "Patricia, I was going to rake my leaves that weekend. You didn't give me a chance. You violated my property rights, the HOA bylaws, and basic common decency. The settlement wasn't about leaves. It was about you thinking you could do whatever you wanted without consequences." "How dare you?" she hissed. "I have worked tirelessly for this community." "You've terrorized this community," another voice called out. I turned and saw Mrs. Chen standing near the middle of the room. "You fined my nephew when he stayed with me for 2 weeks because he parked his car on the street instead of in my driveway. You threatened the Robinsons with legal action over a mailbox. You sent violation notices to the Patels because their daughter drew hopscotch squares on their driveway with chalk. This has gone on long enough." Other homeowners began voicing their agreement, sharing their own stories of Patricia's overreach. The meeting devolved into chaos for several minutes until Frank banged a gavel on the table. "Order, please. We need to proceed with the vote. All those in favor of removing Patricia Hendricks as HOA president, please raise your hand." Nearly every hand in the room went up, including those of the other 3 board members. Patricia looked around in shock, her face pale. All opposed. 2 hands stayed down, belonging to Patricia and one other homeowner I didn't recognize. "The motion carries overwhelmingly," Frank announced. "Patricia, effective immediately, you are removed as president of the Maple Grove Estates Homeowners Association. We'll hold elections for a new president next month." Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out of the clubhouse without another word. The door slammed behind her, and the room erupted in applause. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me. Apparently, my willingness to stand up to Patricia had inspired others to speak out about their own experiences. Frank pulled me aside and shook my hand. "I'm sorry it came to this, Vincent. We should have reined her in sooner." "Why didn't you?" he sighed. "Honestly, nobody else wanted the job, and Patricia seemed competent at first. By the time we realized how bad it had gotten, she had consolidated power. She controlled the finances, the violation process, everything. It felt impossible to challenge her without causing a huge mess." "Well, the mess happened anyway." "True, but maybe it was necessary." He paused. "Would you consider running for the board? We need people who understand boundaries and respect homeowner rights." I thought about it for a moment. The idea of getting more involved in HOA politics wasn't particularly appealing, but I also didn't want to see another Patricia take over. "Let me think about it," I said. Over the next few weeks, life in Maple Grove Estates gradually improved. The new interim president, Frank Morrison, sent out a community-wide email apologizing for the previous administration's overreach and promising a more balanced approach to enforcement. Several of the more ridiculous rules were revised or eliminated entirely. Patricia's house went up for sale in early December. I saw her once more, loading boxes into a moving truck on a gray Saturday morning. She glared at me as I drove past, but I just waved politely. I had won, and we both knew it. The check I received from the settlement paid for a new riding lawnmower, a complete set of professional landscaping tools, and a very nice security camera system for my property. I had the cameras installed in early January, making sure they covered every angle of my yard. If anyone ever tried to trespass again, I would have crystal clear video evidence. The financial disclosure also revealed something interesting. When the new treasurer, a certified accountant named David Brennan, conducted a full audit of the HOA's books, he discovered that Patricia had been regularly using HOA funds for personal expenses. Nothing huge, but a pattern of small charges at restaurants, gas stations, and department stores. Over 3 years, she had embezzled approximately $12,000. Frank called me in late January to inform me of the findings. "We're filing a police report," he said. "This is beyond HOA business now. This is theft." "Good," I replied. "She needs to face real consequences." The Delaware State Police opened an investigation in early February. I provided them with copies of all my documentation from the trespassing incident, which helped establish Patricia's pattern of boundary violations and misuse of authority. The detective assigned to the case, a no-nonsense woman named Detective Sarah Brenner, interviewed multiple homeowners and reviewed years of HOA financial records. In March, Patricia was arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. The arrest made the local news, and I watched the broadcast with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice was being served. Sadness because the whole situation could have been avoided if Patricia had just followed the rules she claimed to care so much about. Her preliminary hearing was scheduled for late April. Frank asked if I would be willing to testify about my experience with Patricia's unauthorized use of HOA funds for the lawn crew. I agreed without hesitation. The hearing took place in a small courtroom in Wilmington. Patricia sat at the defendant's table with a public defender, looking diminished in her gray pantsuit. Her characteristic confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. They showed bank statements, receipts, and credit card charges. They called Sandra Liu to testify about HOA financial procedures and how Patricia had violated them repeatedly. They called David Brennan to explain the audit findings. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Amanda Ross, asked me to describe what had happened with the lawn crew. I explained the whole situation calmly and clearly. How I came home to find workers on my property, how Patricia had hired them without my permission, how she had used HOA funds without board authorization. I showed them the work order, the settlement agreement, and the financial disclosure. And did Miss Hendricks ever apologize for her actions? Amanda asked. Only after she was forced to as part of the settlement. Did she ever acknowledge that what she did was wrong? No. She maintained that she was following HOA bylaws even though she clearly wasn't. Patricia's attorney Cross examined me briefly, trying to suggest that I had blown the situation out of proportion. But the facts were the facts, and my documentation was thorough. After 2 days of testimony, the judge found probable cause to proceed to trial. Patricia's bail was set at $50,000, which she posted through a bondsman. The trial date was set for July. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued to improve. The HOA held elections in May, and a retired teacher named Robert Young was elected president. Robert's platform was simple: enforce reasonable rules reasonably, communicate with homeowners, and maintain transparency. He won in a landslide. I ended up accepting a position as a board member at large, which meant I didn't have specific duties but could vote on major decisions and provide input on policies. It was a good balance, allowing me to have a voice without taking over my life. Patricia's trial began on July 15th. It lasted a week. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Multiple homeowners testified about her misuse of authority. The forensic accountant who had examined the HOA books testified about the pattern of unauthorized expenses. Even Patricia's own emails and text messages, which the police had obtained through a warrant, showed her contempt for the rules she was supposed to uphold. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had made mistakes, but hadn't acted with criminal intent. Her attorney painted her as an overworked volunteer who had occasionally mixed up personal and HOA expenses without meaning to. But the prosecution countered with evidence showing that the expenses were consistently personal and that Patricia had gone to lengths to hide them in the HOA's records. I attended most of the trial, sitting in the gallery and watching justice unfold. On the final day, closing arguments were presented. Amanda Ross was eloquent and forceful, summarizing the evidence and explaining why Patricia's actions constituted criminal behavior. "This wasn't a series of innocent mistakes," Amanda told the jury. "This was a pattern of deliberate theft and abuse of power. Patricia Hendricks was entrusted with her neighbors' money and their community's well-being. She betrayed that trust repeatedly, using HOA funds for personal gain and violating homeowners' rights when they didn't conform to her standards. The evidence is clear, and the verdict should be too." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Patricia broke down crying as the verdict was read. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, but there was nothing more he could do. Sentencing was scheduled for August 20th. In Delaware, embezzlement of this amount carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison and restitution of the full amount stolen. The prosecution recommended 3 years and full restitution, given the deliberate nature of the crimes and the violation of community trust. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial. Several homeowners gave victim impact statements, describing how Patricia's actions had affected them and the community. Mrs. Chen spoke about the stress and anxiety of living under Patricia's regime. Frank Morrison talked about the financial damage to the HOA and the work required to restore trust. When it was my turn, I kept my statement brief. Patricia Hendricks violated my property rights and my trust. She used her position of authority to bully and intimidate people who were supposed to be her neighbors. The consequences she faces today are entirely of her own making. I hope she uses this time to reflect on her actions and become a better person. Patricia's attorney presented character witnesses who testified that she had been a devoted mother and active community volunteer before becoming HOA president. Her ex-husband even appeared, saying that the stress of the position had changed her. It was almost sympathetic, except for the fact that Patricia had chosen her actions every step of the way. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Martha Crawford, listened to everything carefully. When it was time to deliver the sentence, she looked directly at Patricia. "Miss Hendricks, you were given a position of trust and authority within your community. Instead of using that position to serve your neighbors, you used it to serve yourself. You stole money that wasn't yours. You violated people's rights. You created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of community trust. I'm sentencing you to 2.5 years in state prison, with credit for time served. You will also pay full restitution of $12,000 to the Maple Grove Estates HOA, plus the $7,000 you cost them in the settlement with Mr. Garrison. Additionally, you will serve 3 years of probation after your release, during which you are prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position." Patricia was led away in handcuffs, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that it was over, satisfaction that justice had been served, but also a tinge of sadness that it had come to this. After the sentencing, several neighbors and I went to a nearby restaurant to decompress. We talked about the trial, the community, and what came next. There was a sense of closure, but also hope. Maple Grove Estates had been through a difficult period, but we had emerged stronger and more united. Over the following months, the HOA implemented numerous reforms. We created a system of checks and balances to prevent any one person from having too much control. We established clear procedures for property inspections and violation notices, including mandatory written notice and appeal processes. We hired a professional management company to handle the finances, removing the temptation for future board members to misuse funds. Most importantly, we fostered a culture of communication and mutual respect. Board meetings became opportunities for real dialogue rather than dictatorial pronouncements. Homeowners felt comfortable voicing concerns without fear of retaliation. My own life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I maintained my yard meticulously, not because I was afraid of violations, but because I took pride in my property. I got to know my neighbors better, attending community events and even hosting a 4th of July barbecue in my backyard. Mrs. Chen became a good friend. We had dinner together once a month, and she taught me how to make proper Chinese dumplings. She told me stories about her life in Taiwan before immigrating to America, and I shared my own experiences growing up in Pennsylvania. The security cameras I had installed proved useful not for catching trespassers, but for capturing wildlife. I got some great footage of deer, foxes, and even a family of raccoons that liked to play in my yard at night. I started a neighborhood social media page where people could share their own wildlife videos and photos. In October, nearly a year after the original leaf incident, I was raking my yard again. This time, I did it on my own schedule, taking my time and enjoying the crisp autumn air. As I worked, Robert Young walked by with his golden retriever. "Yard looks great, Vincent," he called out. "Thanks, Robert. Just trying to stay ahead of the leaves this year," he laughed. "Well, if you need help, just let me know, though I promise to ask first." We both chuckled, and he continued his walk. It was a small moment, but it represented how much things had changed. The fear and tension that had defined the neighborhood under Patricia's rule were gone, replaced by friendliness and community spirit. In November, I received a letter from the Department of Corrections. It was from Patricia. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a handwritten note on prison stationery. "Vincent, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. A real apology, not the forced one from the settlement. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did and why I did it. I was wrong. I let power go to my head, and I hurt people who deserved better. I hurt you specifically, and I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize how badly I messed up. I hope the neighborhood is doing well. Patricia." I read the letter twice, then filed it away in the folder with all the other documents from the case. It was genuine, or at least it seemed to be. Whether Patricia had truly changed or was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear, I couldn't know. But I appreciated the gesture. I never wrote back. Some things didn't need a response. By the time the first anniversary of the trespassing incident rolled around, Maple Grove Estates had been transformed. The HOA operated smoothly under professional management. Violations were handled fairly and according to proper procedures. Board members worked collaboratively rather than autocratically, and homeowners felt respected and heard. I hosted a small gathering at my house to mark the occasion, inviting the neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and watched the sunset from my back deck. Mrs. Chen brought homemade pot stickers. Frank Morrison brought his famous potato salad. Sandra Liu brought wine. It was perfect. As we sat around talking and laughing, I reflected on how a simple dispute over leaves had spiraled into criminal charges and prison time for Patricia. It seemed almost absurd in retrospect. If she had just followed the rules, if she had just asked permission, if she had just treated people with basic respect, none of it would have happened. But she hadn't, and it did, and now we were all better off for it. The $8,000 bill I had sent Patricia, which had started as an angry gesture of defiance, had ultimately led to exposing years of financial fraud and abuse of power. It had freed an entire community from a petty tyrant and established safeguards to prevent it from happening again. Not a bad outcome for refusing to be pushed around. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Mrs. Chen pulled me aside. "Thank you, Vincent," she said softly, "for standing up when the rest of us were too afraid." "I was just protecting my property," I replied. She shook her head. "No, you did more than that. You protected all of us." After everyone left, I cleaned up and went inside. The house felt warm and welcoming, filled with the lingering energy of good friends and good conversation. This was what a community was supposed to feel like. I walked upstairs to my home office and looked at the framed copy of the settlement agreement hanging on the wall. Marcus had suggested I frame it as a reminder of the victory, and I had done so half-jokingly. But now I was glad I had. It represented something important, the principle that people have rights, and those rights are worth defending. The next morning, I received an email from Robert Young. The HOA had been nominated for a national award recognizing communities that had successfully reformed their governance structures. Our story, minus the most personal details, had been featured in an HOA management journal as an example of how to recover from leadership failures. "We're thinking about attending the awards ceremony in Orlando next month," Robert wrote. "Would you like to come as part of the HOA delegation? All expenses paid." I wrote back accepting the invitation. It would be my first time representing Maple Grove Estates in any official capacity, and it felt right. The awards ceremony in December was held at a large hotel convention center. Hundreds of HOA board members, property managers, and community leaders from across the country attended. Our community didn't win the top prize, but we received an honorable mention, and Robert gave a brief speech about our journey. During the networking reception afterward, I spoke with board members from other communities facing similar challenges with overreaching leadership. I shared our story and the reforms we had implemented. Several people asked for my contact information so they could follow up with questions. It felt good to know that our experience might help others. On the flight home, I sat next to Sandra Liu, who had also attended the ceremony. We talked about how surreal the whole experience had been, from the initial trespassing incident to criminal trial to national recognition. "Do you ever regret how hard you pushed?" Sandra asked. "I mean, Patricia ended up in prison. That's pretty serious." I thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret that it had to come to that, but I don't regret standing up for myself. Patricia made her choices. She could have apologized and made things right at any point. She chose to double down instead. The embezzlement would have been discovered eventually anyway, with or without my involvement." Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I just sometimes feel guilty that we didn't catch it sooner as board members. You can't blame yourself for trusting someone who seemed trustworthy. That's on Patricia, not you." We spent the rest of the flight discussing lighter topics, and by the time we landed in Wilmington, I felt at peace with everything that had happened. The following spring brought new growth to Maple Grove Estates, both literally and figuratively. Flowers bloomed in well-tended gardens. Trees that had been planted by the HOA years ago grew taller and stronger. Children played in the streets without parents worrying about violation notices for sidewalk chalk. I continued serving on the board, helping to maintain the positive changes we had implemented. We started a community garden project, organized neighborhood watch programs, and hosted quarterly social events to keep people connected. Patricia was released from prison in early 2026 after serving 18 months with good behavior. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to Pennsylvania to live with her sister and was working as a receptionist at a dental office. She kept a low profile and, as far as I knew, never tried to contact anyone from the neighborhood again. The $7,000 from the settlement, combined with the riding mower and tools I had purchased, made yard maintenance something I actually enjoyed rather than dreaded. I took pride in keeping my property looking good, not because someone was forcing me to, but because it was mine and I cared about it. On the second anniversary of the trespassing incident, I was out raking leaves again when a moving truck pulled up to the house that Patricia had lived in. A young couple in their early 30s got out and started directing the movers. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hi, I'm Vincent Garrison. I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." The woman, who introduced herself as Jennifer Torres, smiled warmly. "Thanks. We're excited to be here. Everyone we've talked to has said such great things about this community." "It's a good place to live," I said honestly. "The HOA is reasonable, the neighbors are friendly, and we all look out for each other." Her husband, Michael, joined us. "That's exactly what we were hoping for. Our last neighborhood had this nightmare HOA president who made everyone miserable." I couldn't help but smile. "Really? What happened?" "Oh, she was just on a power trip, fining people for everything, making up rules as she went along. It got so bad that several homeowners sued the HOA. Last I heard, she was forced to resign." "Sounds familiar," I said. "We had a similar situation here, actually." "How did you handle it?" "We held her accountable. Sometimes that's the only option." Jennifer nodded approvingly. "Good for you. Too many people just put up with bullies because it's easier than fighting back." "True, but fighting back can be worth it if you do it the right way. Document everything, know your rights, and don't back down when you're in the right." We chatted for a few more minutes before I left them to their unpacking. As I walked back to my house, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. Maple Grove Estates had gone from a neighborhood ruled by fear to a true community. Property values had actually increased because people wanted to live somewhere with good governance and friendly neighbors. The lawsuit, the settlement, the criminal trial, all of it had been stressful and time-consuming. But it had also been necessary. Patricia had needed to face consequences for her actions, and the community had needed to reclaim its autonomy. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything. The $8,000 bill I had sent for trespassing had been perfectly justified. It had established that my property rights mattered, and that violations would not be tolerated. It had also set in motion a chain of events that ultimately made life better for everyone in the neighborhood. That evening, I sat on my back deck with a cold beer, watching the sun set behind the trees. The leaves were mostly raked, my yard looked great, and I had no HOA president breathing down my neck. Life was good. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Dinner next week, I'm making dumplings." I texted back immediately. "Absolutely, I'll bring wine." This was what community was supposed to be. Not rules enforced by threats and intimidation, but neighbors helping neighbors, people looking out for each other, and respect flowing in all directions. The legal documents from the case were filed away in my office, a reminder of the battle, but not something I dwelled on. The security cameras continued recording, though they mostly captured squirrels and the occasional delivery driver. The riding mower sat in my garage, ready for action whenever I needed it, and Patricia Hendricks was somewhere in Pennsylvania, hopefully living a quieter, more humble life after learning that authority comes with responsibility, and that violating people's rights has consequences. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be, in my home, in my neighborhood, with my rights intact and my dignity preserved. I had stood up to a bully, protected my property, and helped create positive change in my community. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to rake his leaves in peace. The stars came out overhead, bright and clear in the November sky. I finished my beer, went inside and locked the door behind me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. And that was worth more than $8,000 could ever measure.